So some time ago I posted a review of Miss Pac-Man for the Nintendo Entertainment System, specifically the version put out by Tengen in 1990. A quick refresher for anyone confused by this statement. The NES actually received two conversions of Miss Pac-Man. The first was released in 1990 as an unlicensed game cartridge by Tengen and featured a wide variety of gameplay options that made it a solid port of Miss Pac-Man to the console. This iteration of Miss Pac-Man would eventually make its way over to the Sega Genesis in 1991, as well as the Super Nintendo in 1996. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. In November of 1993, the NES would be graced with a second conversion of Miss Pac-Man, this time released by Namco, and this version would be licensed by Nintendo for play on your Nintendo Entertainment System. Unfortunately, this version of Miss Pac-Man was not the same as the Tengen release from 3 years prior. In fact, despite coming from the same company that originated the Pac-Man franchise, the Namco release on the NES is actually a bit of a letdown. Now note, I didn't say this was a bad port, just that it was a letdown considering what NES owners had before. For the most part, this is a somewhat straight-up conversion of Miss Pac-Man, well, almost straight up. I think they messed up on the colors of the various mazes since they don't match up with the original maze colors from the arcade game. Oh, wait, the maze changes colors as you clear levels. What? Anyway, you have all 4 arcade mazes in this version of Miss Pac-Man, and they all look to be perfectly replicated from the arcade original aside from the shifting colors. It's pretty much old hat for anyone familiar with Miss Pac-Man. Clear the maze of dots, avoid the ghost, eat the energizers, power pellets, whatever you want to call it, to turn ghosts blue so you can eat them, blah blah blah. You should know this stuff already. Game's been out for 50 frickin' years already. And well, yeah, that's it. You have 2-player alternating play. You could choose either the arcade skill level or the hard skill level, but that's about it. No additional maze variations aside from whatever might be hidden in later levels that all but a few skilled folks may never get to see. No 2-player co-op or competitive modes. It's just Miss Pac-Man with color shifting mazes. Controls fairly responsive, works well enough. Some people might consider the game to be a bit too slow, but well, yeah, that's all it really is. Now, while it's easy to put this game down for being such a bare-bones release, there are 2 aspects of Namco's version of Miss Pac-Man that it does better than the Tengen version. For one thing, you could see the entire maze on screen, which will no doubt please those who are miffed by the Tengen version's constant scrolling up and down, all that. The graphics themselves are nothing out of the ordinary. Miss Pac-Man looks like Miss Pac-Man, the ghosts look like ghosts, the animations are in there, and the maze layouts match those of the arcade original, shifting colors notwithstanding. The maze walls do seem a bit thicker in comparison to the arcade game, but this has no overall effect on gameplay or anything. It's just something that I noticed. Another positive aspect is that the Namco version has much better sound. Despite the overall impressive and varied content, the Tengen version of Miss Pac-Man had sound effects so painful that even a deaf man would wince. And in all honesty, the Namco version doesn't really sound that much better, but at the very least it's somewhat pleasing to the ears and it doesn't sound terrible. Faint praise, but whatever, I'll take it. On its own merits, this Namco edition of Miss Pac-Man on the NES seems like a fairly competent conversion of the arcade original that feels like a marginal improvement over the Pac-Man port from years prior. Color shifting mazes aside, the bare essentials of gameplay have been retained. Control is tight, sounds decent, and it's a solid game overall, so it's not terrible. Namco did a good job porting Miss Pac-Man over to the NES. It's fine for what it is. The problem is that this came out 3 years after another company already ported Miss Pac-Man. Not only port the game, but added a lot of content to it that made it such a well-rounded package, and ultimately this effort just comes off as half-assed as bare bones. For my money, the Tengen version of Miss Pac-Man is the definitive NES conversion. Aside from the subpar sound and the scrolling of the screen, it plays great and comes with a bunch of options that expands on the gameplay immensely and gives the game tons of replay value. Not to mention the arcade mazes look like the arcade mazes, right down to the colors used and applied. Meanwhile, the Namco port of Miss Pac-Man offers a bare-bones conversion of the arcade original and a half-hearted skill setting. It's a solid port, don't get me wrong, and it's still a pretty fun game because goddammit, it's Miss Pac-Man, it's already a fun game to begin with. But the Namco port is more akin to a cheapo DVD release of a movie that has the bare minimum of content and was released a short time after a more extravagant release with documentaries, outtakes, alternate cuts and things of that nature. Maybe if we had gotten this version first rather than the Tengen release, since Namco originally made the Famicom version in 1985 before waiting 8 years to pull it out of their ass for North American audiences on the NES, but that's sort of a moot point either way. Let me pull out of this ball of negativity and just bottom line it. If you like Ms. Pac-Man and you own an NES, I highly suggest tracking down the Tengen version since it's the superior conversion in many ways. But if you happen to come across this Namco release for a cheap price, go ahead and pick this one up because despite the bare bones offerings, it's still a pretty decent port of Ms. Pac-Man. Not perfect, but enough to get your fix.